The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. Hello, I'm Thomas Salerno, and you're listening to The Secrets of Tora, Tora, the epic-scale 1970 World War II film about the Day of Infamy, the Japanese attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And joining me today on the panel are Dom Bettinelli. Hello, Dom.
Buzzeye! Hey, Thomas.
Very appropriate. Yeah. And Patrick Mason. Hey there, Pat.
Howdy, Thomas.
And be sure to follow along with the Secrets of Movies and TV Shows on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, or on your podcast app of choice. And you can also follow along with the show on the StarQuest YouTube channel. And please do us a favor by sharing the podcast with your friends, because we've got a lot more great movies and shows to discuss in the future, and you don't want to miss each new episode. You can follow StarQuest on social media at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or on Twitter/X, where we are at SQPN, or on Instagram, where we are at StarQuest Network. So I'm really, really excited to talk about this movie, because I think, like both of you, I'm a huge World War II buff.
Yes.
I've loved this stuff since I was very young, because both my grandfathers were World War II veterans, and I didn't get to know either of them very well. And so it's been a topic that's always fascinated me because of that family connection and wanting to get to know the grandfathers that I never really knew. And this is one of the World War II movies that has really been, it's one that I go back to not often. It's almost like every year I almost think to myself, I should watch it.
Yes, yes.
What about you guys?
For me, I've been a World War II history buff since I was in high school. I started with a lot of the Pacific War stuff. I read lots of books about Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the battles across the Pacific. More recently, I've been reading a lot about the European theater, although I recently watched The Pacific, which is an epic, the sequel to the Band of Brothers. Very different from Tora, made in a very different time. But I love Tora. This and the Battle of Midway, the movie Midway, are two. Like, I remember watching this with my dad when I was a kid, and just how awesome they were. They seemed so epic, so big. And I showed my kids a few years ago, maybe a little too soon, because it's a long movie and with lots of Japanese subtitles. I ended up reading most of the movie to them, but they still, when I was telling them I was doing this, they still remember it and they still enjoy it. And my oldest, my daughter, who's 17, she's a big military history buff herself, and she thought, yeah, this is a great movie. This movie is deep in my DNA.
What about you, Pat?
Yes, my grandfather on my mother's side, the Schmidts, he was first generation. So his father had come over from Germany, and he was not able to join until after the war. And so he joined up into the Army Air Corps / Air Force effectively. But my grandfather on my father's side, he was in like the first wave of recruits for the Army Air Corps. And he flew bombers out of he bombed France and Germany out of England. We actually got to go over one time, me and my dad and my uncle, to go see the old airfield where he had flown out of in England, in Atterbridge. Wow. And he actually got shot down over France in the German occupied portion and was successfully smuggled out by the French resistance. So
wow.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah.
We were going through some old papers and we found my mom's father's demobilization papers. And we actually found out what he did in them, because we really didn't know. We had heard that he worked with radios. So at first I thought, okay, he's one of the guys with those big backpack radios, like in a squad, the communications guy. But no, it turns out he was actually an engineer. He built like these, back then, state-of-the-art wireless transmitter towers for wireless communications. And he did this during the Battle of the Bulge under fire.
Wow.
He had to build these big, and his unit got a citation for bravery under fire because they had to build this stuff. We didn't know any of that until discovering these papers. And he was my namesake. He was Thomas Murray. And so I'm named after him. And so it was so cool to come across those tangible papers. And he died before I was born, so I never met him. It's funny, he never talked about the war, but he loved watching World War II movies. He would watch Patton, my mom tells me, over and over again.
Yeah.
So if I had ever gotten a chance to talk to him, we would have had a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That is
I can
amazing.
remember both my grandparents at my graduation dinner started talking about it. And I was probably, my dad says that's the first time he really ever talked about it. And it was that sort of that generation, they didn't really want to talk about the war, but they would talk to each other about it.
Yeah.
And if you were lucky enough to be in the room, you could get some details.
Patrick, you're going to probably enjoy the new Apple TV Plus series coming up, Masters of the Air, which is like the third installment in this Band of Brothers series that they're doing, covering the 8th Air Force flying out of England to bombing missions over France and Germany.
Wow.
It's coming up in January, I think, as we record.
That soon?
Yeah.
Like I keep
nice.
thinking about, man, I don't know if I want to support Apple or Apple, but they just keep coming out with shows I have to watch. Like the Monsterverse is coming
Like
out.
Godzilla,
It's just-
I'm so glad to be an Apple person.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. But yeah, if you ever want to see a picture of my grandfather, there's a guy who his grandfather was in the same unit. It wrote a book called Much Too Pretty, and it actually has a picture of the unit on the book. And so my grandfather's the captain in that picture.
Nice.
So yeah, it's and his bomber was called Ain't Misbehaving, if I remember correctly.
Nice.
Oh, that's a cool name. I like that. Dom, you mentioned like the scale of this movie. I feel like they don't make movies like this anymore. And I'm not a camera person, but I feel like they must have filmed this in some sort of insane wide frame because that's what it looks like.
Oh.
It doesn't look like other movies that are made now.
It's an epic movie, just in the scale, the number of stars. You look at the cast list. It is a massive production. It was 2 productions, essentially. We should probably mention that it was there was a U.S. film crew and there was a Japanese film crew filming separately the 2 parts of this movie. That right there just shows you like how big the scale of that. And when you think about it, the people making this movie, many of them probably remembered or even fought in World War II. This was still their generation making this movie. And so it makes it even that more meaningful when you watch it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, I don't know. Yeah, I love how they bring the 2 sides together because it really gives you that perspective. It's something they wouldn't have done if this movie were about America versus the Germans. They probably wouldn't have done it this way.
To have a German film crew. Yeah.
Yeah. And to have so much of the German perspective because, and this time watching the movie, I really thought a lot about it that like, okay, like when the Allies fought Nazi Germany, obviously they're the Nazis and they want to take over the world and commit genocide and do all this stuff. But it feels like with America and Japan, as you watch the movie, you get the sense like this didn't need to happen, but it becomes inevitable because people on both sides either want it to happen or don't do enough to stop it from happening. And it's that kind of, it reminds me of that book about World War I. It's called, I think it's called The Sleepwalkers, where like the different countries in Europe just stumbled into war without even knowing it. And that's what it feels like with America and Japan. Like obviously America had problems with Japan's expansionism in China and the things that it was doing there. But it almost seems the way the movie tells it, it really seems like this was avoidable and it didn't need to happen.
In fact, the way the movie tells it I think is that in Japan, there were 2 sides. There was the army really wanted this to happen. And Tojo, who was the foreign minister who basically running the government, running things in Japan at the time, the army wanted this to happen. Everybody else didn't. Japan was the empire and needed to be great, but it didn't need to go to war with America. That was, and that becomes clear. And Yamamoto was famously, opposed to going to war with America. I'm sure we get into that as we go through our discussion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. This movie feels like on both sides, and on the American side, just the inevitability, the missed opportunities to avoid the devastation. And it's just watching this movie every time I'm like, oh, if only someone listened, if only someone picked up the phone or paid attention.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's written like a tragedy that way, where it's like a slow motion train wreck that you see coming and you're just like, oh, yeah.
It reminds me of the end of Romeo and Juliet, where basically they send the message, but it gets outrun by the other guy. And so the tragedy occurs, but it didn't have to. And it's just that over and over and over again.
Yes.
And over again. Somebody.
It's what makes it even more tragic is it's bad if something bad happens. If a 9/11 happens, a terrorist attack, that's bad. But then if it turns out that we had all of the data ahead of time and we knew that who the guys were and what planes they were going to be on, and we just by incompetence didn't stop them or that sort of thing, or just bad luck, it makes the tragedy all the worse, I think.
And you get the sense, too, that like unlike the Nazi regime, this isn't a government that's completely all run by evil people.
It's very hard to wrap my mind around how the Japanese government worked at the time, because the emperor was both a figurehead and not. And then you also had the civil government, which was under this continuous threat of government by assassination. So like any given time, the prime minister, the army official might try and kill the prime minister, or the Navy guy might try and kill a cabinet member, and then you have the army and the Navy constantly. You talk about rivalries within the service in the U.S., and it's somewhat joking and somewhat not joking, but like over there, it was very much not joking. They hated each other.
It was no joke. They would try to kill each other.
Yeah, and the Japanese army just continuously, via the invasion of Manchuria, committed Japan to this course of action where they had to keep increasing the Navy and the army to continue to invade. Like it was just a sort of roller coaster that the army kind of got them on. And
right. It's like they need resources to continue the war effort. But because they're continuing the war effort, America keeps putting sanctions on them. So they don't have the resources to continue the war effort. And then they're like, we'll just attack America then and then seize the resources.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, because at the time, America was the source of a lot of the resources of war material, which is what made us so powerful in World War II, because we had the mines in Colorado and Montana and Wyoming, and we had oil fields. And because, mind you, Middle Eastern oil fields were not discovered at this point. They were not a thing yet. Those were post World War II. And Japan really depended on us for a lot of things, and we kept sanctioning them, and they kept getting angrier. And like you said, they're going to go to war to take what they need. At least that was the army's point of view.
The rationale, yeah. And I think that's a good point for us to dive in really to the Japanese point of view, because as you said, they essentially filmed two movies, but they're interspersed in the film itself, but we can separate them out. That opening scene I want to highlight because the music that's associated with the Japanese segments, man, something about it. I don't know, that tune gets stuck in my head sometimes. And whenever I see footage of the Imperial Japanese Navy,
yes,
that musical theme from Tora, Tora, Tora comes back into my mind. It's an epic music, but at the same time, it's haunting and ominous. And I just like whenever I hear that, I just think Imperial Japanese Navy
right in
my head. I just love the music of that segment.
And there is a long opening segment. That is a long, and it's basically the changeover ceremony for the commander in chief for Yamamoto to take over. And one of the things that strikes me about the opening is the Japanese Navy. Japan is an Asian culture. It has very different cultural origins. But the Navy itself looked very modern and very much like the West. It had a lot of the Western traditions, the bells and the uniforms and the piping aboard. And I looked it up. By 1920, the Japanese Navy was the third largest in the world after the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy. And that compares that to 1854, when they had virtually no Navy, when Commodore Perry showed up and opened up Japan to the world. And so in 70 odd years, they went from almost nothing to the third largest Navy in the world. That is a remarkable growth of power in Japan. It's hard to understate how strong Japan was at the start of World War II.
The fact that they're able to muster 6 aircraft carriers for this strike force
Yes.
is phenomenal. That's a lot of muscle. And that's not counting all the escort ships. And they talk several times in movies, what if we're detected? What do we do? The fact that they're not detected, one of those just, I don't know, accidents of history. Like it's astounding that they weren't detected with a force that large.
There were a couple of close calls. They aren't in the movie, but there were a couple of close calls where PBYs, the patrol sea boats, saw something, but nobody took it seriously. And it was in the movie, this whole thing, like they kept thinking that the attack was going to be these 5 transports heading toward Malaysia or Philippines, or it was not going to, there was no sense that it was going to be Hawaii, which at the time was U.S. territory, not a state, of course. But yeah, there was the fact that they were able to bring this task force, this massive fleet, within range and execute almost a perfect attack on their end. It was almost perfect.
And if insanely well planned. They stressed that in the movie. They thought of every contingency, every little detail, because they had to. Kind of like the Allies with D-Day. They had to think of every little detail, because if you do one thing wrong, it could snowball into destroying the whole operation.
I really love that scene with Kuroshima, the planner, the senior planner, where he didn't come to dinner.
They call him.
Yeah, they calls him Gandhi, and they send someone to get him, and he's in his cabin, and he's got like a monk's robe over his head, and he's obsessively repeating the different parts of the plan and all the this guy, he's become obsessed with the plan, and it's just amazing. And then it doesn't come out in the movie. Things like Fushida, who was the air commander, he led the attack. Relentless drilling of his pilots, and they were so well prepared for this fight. That's the thing.
The Zero was the finest fighter plane in the world.
Yes,
at this time.
Yes, we didn't have anything to compare to it at the time. We had the F4F and the old F3F, but we like the newer planes that would come along soon that would match up weren't there yet. So our planes were just, even if we could have got them off the ground, they would have been overmatched in the air. And that was like early on in the Midway fight was a similar situation.
But it's like Yamamoto knows that he can't fight a long war with America.
Yes.
Like he mentions at one point, if we fight the Americans, we can't stop at Hawaii or San Francisco. We'll have to march into Washington and dictate peace terms in the White House. And then he says, if you give me 18 months, I can raise hell. But after that, all bets are off. He knew that. After that, they'd essentially run out of stuff. They'd run out of supplies. They'd run out of men. He's like, you can give me 18 months. And then after that, it will devolve into a war of attrition that Japan can't possibly win.
But he also knew that America was the character of America. He called America the sleeping giant. That's one of the lines in the movie, and that's taken from something he actually said. America is a sleeping giant. We may win for 6 months, but after that, the giant will awake. I copied down this quote he makes to the assembled staff at one point. He says, "Many misinformed Japanese believe that America is a nation divided, isolationist, and that Americans are only interested in enjoying a life of luxury and are spiritually and morally corrupt." Which sound familiar to anyone yet? Yeah. But that is a great mistake. If war becomes inevitable, America would be the most formidable foe that we have ever fought. And I'm like, wow. We look back, we say, oh, America, the greatest generation, they were ready. But in one sense, before World War II, they were not much unlike us. They had their divisions, those isolationist voices, and there was a lot of spiritual and moral corruption. He's not wrong. There was a lot of that. And the war galvanized Americans. I feel like there's a recognition by the Japanese filmmakers here of the mistake that Japan made in its assessment of American moral courage at the time. And I think that's an interesting aspect.
I think it in a lot of ways, it's because they're coming off of the Sino-Japanese War, right? And just destroying Russia. Like they just do whatever they want to the Russians.
Oh, they mopped the floor with Russia.
And then the preceding war with the Chinese, where they're pretty much heads and tails over the Chinese as well. And so there is this thought about, okay, we can put up a really good fight. And you look at the previous wars, World War I, and then all of the smaller wars that come from it, and everything is a war of peace terms, right? So like everybody fights, they fight to a standstill, or they get to a point where one wins, and then it's okay, you can keep this area and I'm going to take this area from you, and we're going to negotiate peace terms, and then everybody goes back to their own country. And it very much feels like a lot of the Japanese leadership at the time thought that this was the kind of war they could fight with America. Unfortunately, they didn't read much American war history.
Right.
Unconditional surrender.
Yeah, you look at our history in our fight, and really the War of 1812 being the big blotch on that one. we have a tendency, it's an all or nothing sort of a deal. We backed off on the Mexican-American War. It didn't take all of Mexico. We just took half of it.
Although some wanted to take it. Yeah, some wanted to go.
Yeah, and some wanted to take it all.
Yeah.
There were a lot of voices. And so the concept of this unconditional surrender was probably, it occurred, you can tell it occurred to Yamamoto, because he was like, we're going to have to go all the way. Like, we've got to go into Washington. This is going to go down to somebody invading somebody else's capital. But I think a lot of other people were like, no, it'll get to a point where, we'll sue for peace and we'll get the Philippines, or we'll keep some of these places we've taken. We'll keep Manchuria. And that's especially with how this attack happens, how well it goes for the Japanese, how poorly it goes for the Americans, and the timing. Just not going to happen.
I read that Eisenhower and Marshall and MacArthur and many of the other American generals at this time were very close students of Ulysses Grant and Tecumseh Sherman and their style of warfare, where they were like, we will grind the Confederacy into dust.
Yeah. Right.
Until it's over. And they basically just took that and applied it to Germany and Japan.
Total war.
We will get them. Yeah, total war. They will be on their knees so that this can never happen again.
Right.
Yeah, and having MacArthur in the Pacific, Douglas the Situation MacArthur,
Right.
never missed the best photo op he could get. He was going to make sure that we won the war, and it was spectacular.
It's like MacArthur and Patton are two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yes.
So
they would not have liked each other.
No. They needed, those egos need to be on opposite sides of the planet to have enough room for
Globe,
them.
yeah.
Having just come off World War I and seeing Germany rise again out of those ashes to become a threat again, I think everybody realized that you can't just have a peace and let them do it again. Like, the Axis needed to be totally defeated, and otherwise this evil will rise again, which is a little ironic given that then we allied with Russia and the Soviet Union, and that became the problem. There were some who advocated that we should keep, including Patton, I think, who advocated we should keep marching to Moscow.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Just keep rolling.
Yeah. But one of the things I really thought was interesting about this film, the Japanese side, is that Akira Kurosawa was originally tapped to direct the Japanese side, and he was involved in preparations for 2 years, but he basically quit, fired, agreed to walk away, or whatever you want, because I think he just felt like his vision for what this movie should be was different. And I think it's interesting because the movie doesn't hang a lot on character development, and it's almost like a documentary in style.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like Michael Bay's 2001 Pearl Harbor, which was a dramatic comedy, a dramatic romance. Sorry, Freudian slip. Dramatic romance, a war romance movie, which with very little basing in reality. Whereas this one felt like we want to tell an accurate story of the events of Pearl Harbor. And I think Kurosawa wanted more of a drama. I think was my sense of it.
But despite the fact that there's a huge cast and there's not a lot of, I guess, traditional character development in the traditional sense, I still empathized with a lot of these characters.
Oh, yeah.
And what they're going through.
Yeah, Yamamoto comes across as a very sympathetic figure. In fact, I don't feel like anybody on the Japanese side feels like the enemy. In fact, I don't feel like there's a
Tojo, maybe.
right. So I think he becomes almost. I was going to say caricature, but that's actually how he really was. But
But some people are caricatures.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that there's a traditional antagonist protagonist in this movie. Now, clearly, the Japanese are the bad guys because we're Americans. But if I was trying to imagine a Japanese person watching this film and saying, look at how well we did this. And sure, there was some misunderstandings and some miscommunication that meant the attack happened before they knew it was going to come. That's just bad luck. We declared war and we did a great job at it. And I could see someone being able to say that.
I felt so bad for Ambassador Nomura when he goes in for that last meeting with Hull, because you could tell on his face he never wanted this.
Yeah.
He didn't want this to happen. And the whole comedy of errors with getting the message typed up and everything, and he couldn't get it in there in time. And he just knows, like, because his job as a diplomat is to prevent these kinds of things from happening.
Right.
And he just looks so defeated and demoralized when he tries to offer Hull solace, but he's not having it. He's just get out.
I think that's why they sent the other guy to Washington, the other ambassador, Kurusu, because he was a hawk. He was more, because he's the guy who signed the Axis alliance in Germany. Like, he was on that side. Whereas Nomura, he liked America. He liked Americans. He didn't want to go to war with America. He liked the Americans that he dealt with in the diplomatic circle. And it's the poor guy. And then they have this comedy of errors where they're having to decode and type up this message. And it's like the classic, and get it done in 10 minutes. We had to send the typist home because it's too high security, top secret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And meanwhile, our guys already have it on our side, that sort of thing. Which actually I want to talk about the decoding stuff when we get to the American side. But yeah, I felt so bad. Like, you could see the actor was doing such a great job of portraying how Nomura was devastated at having delivered this message.
Yeah, and you think about Nomura, he's in line with both the civilian government and the emperor. Like, they didn't want this to happen, like almost flat. There were portions of the parliament that were for it, of course. All the prime minister and the higher ups, they're all dodging bullets while trying to sue for peace, hiding in their house. You know, I want to say the prime minister had an attempt on his life running up to and he had to hide in like a closet or something, and his brother ended up getting killed for him because his brother looked like him, and he
attended his own funeral.
Yeah, it was like, and that was the kind of government that was under play.
We had an episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on the end of the war in Japan, basically the coup, the attempted coup.
I love that episode.
Yeah,
you guys did a fantastic job with that.
I'm trying to find the link.
I listen to it every once in a while.
Oh, okay, so it's
coup.
Yeah, the desperate coup in Japan, episode 113. So if you go to mysterious.fm/113, we also did a couple episodes on Pearl Harbor, because there's always these theories about, was Pearl Harbor an inside job? Was there more to it than what we know? So we did a couple of episodes on that, and that was a little later, episodes 184 and 185. So mysterious.fm/184 and /185. But I remember when we did that episode on the coup, just how chaotic it was in Japan, the politically, and desperately dangerous. And we don't get a lot of that in this movie. We get the sense that there was chaos and opposition, but we don't get like we get hinted at that there's this assassinations. I think they claim Yamamoto was a coward at the beginning because he ran away from Tokyo, where he was vice minister for the Navy to become commander in chief of the Navy. And they some of the officers saw that as cowardly. And it's interesting because they don't explain that, but you have to pick it up from context, why they're saying that.
Yeah, and you can see how there's all these rivalries when they're sitting down to plan the whole thing. And the one guy raises not unreasonable objections. The other guys, to criticize the plan is defeatist. And like, they almost have a duel with one another, basically. And I'm like, to criticize the plan is defeatist is not good, like, management.
No, that is bad. That's how plans fail.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I liked how they showed the mindset of early adoption of the airplane as being the number one thing. going forward. This was going to be what was going to win you the war, the sea battle, the sea control, effectively. And you had folks, I remember you had folks in the meeting who were still all about the battleships. No, this is going to be ship-to-ship combat. And you have that sort of, okay, they sunk a couple of carriers in the Mediterranean. Maybe we can pull off something similar. And then they pull off Pearl Harbor, and it's clear as day. Like the airplane is it. Like
Pearl Harbor was the death knell of the battleship.
Yes, literally and figuratively. Yeah. I mean, that it was that clearly showed the superiority of planes over battleships.
To transfer over to the American side, Dom, you mentioned the Magic
Operation
intercepts.
Magic. Yeah.
Operation Magic, where they're intercepting the diplomatic cables of Japan, and they're decoding them. And it's also interesting, like you mentioned how you've done a couple of episodes of Mysterious World on the different Pearl Harbor conspiracies. It's interesting. There is a line in the movie where one of the guys involved with Magic says, "We don't trust certain men close to the president."
You're right. And in fact,
and I was like, ooh, what does that mean? Because they don't explain it.
Right. And Jimmy, in our episode, there is at least one of the president's close advisors, I should have looked it up, but I forget his name, who was untrustworthy. We may have been working the other side, or at least working under the table to bring about peace or to keep America out of the war, put it that way. And so they were right to be concerned. And I thought it was very interesting that the behind the closed door, the diagram, who the 12 apostles, they were called, who could see the magic intercepts. We should explain, the U.S. had broken the Japanese codes and could decode their messages that they were being sent back and forth, which was a huge advantage. And we had the same advantage with Enigma against the Germans. It's not overstating to say those actions changed the war, pretty much in many ways won us the war. But having this Operation Magic, but what was interesting was, like, at one point Roosevelt wasn't allowed to get the intercepts because
they knocked him off the list
because he was being careless with them or something. Yeah,
threw it in the waste paper basket. That's what they said in the movie. And Roosevelt's a tough one because he's a very enigmatic figure. We have a lot about what he did and the things he said in public, but very much like Washington, we don't really have a lot of his private thoughts. He was very guarded and he was very political. And so him, like, trying to figure out what was he trying to do, or what were his thoughts about this, it's a very difficult nut to crack.
It's interesting that the more I read about FDR, the less I like him.
Yeah.
Some ways it's like that with Churchill. I like Churchill, but there are aspects that he was not a perfect, he was a flawed man. He was flawed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, interesting that they did not have Roosevelt in this movie. They did not think it was important, that he was important to the overall narrative of what happens. Since I think that's a fascinating omission. I don't think it's wrong necessarily, but I think it's interesting that they didn't include him.
It's really the only fault I have with the film is that they don't have the speech.
Yeah.
That's like the only thing the Michael Bay film did better is they had the speech in it. And if you ever watch the Michael Bay film, don't just stop there. Don't watch the rest of it. Just
watch that part. Go find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
It is an incredible speech.
Yeah.
It is amazing. It's almost Churchillian. It's almost like he studied the way Churchill would deliver a speech like that and did it in an American context.
Right. They will stop him at the beaches speech of Churchill.
Right.
Yeah. It's at that level.
I wonder if they left Roosevelt out because Roosevelt's mind was more on the Atlantic anyway, right. And when we get in the war, we sign on to the Germany first policy.
Yep.
Where the idea is we will do, since Germany's the more immediate threat to Britain and America, we need to defeat them first, and Japan can be left till later. So even though Roosevelt loved the Navy, he used to be assistant secretary of the Navy at one point in his political career. He loved the Navy to death, but he really wasn't that focused on the Pacific. He was focused on the undeclared naval war against Germany's U-boats in the Atlantic that was going on.
The war we've been fighting for 2 years, but no, we're not really fighting this war. We're not.
Yes.
Which Hitler mentions in his speech, by the way, declaring war on America. Hitler's like, well, we've basically been fighting you for 2 years anyway.
Right. It's like the American undeclared war in Ukraine. We won't get into contemporary politics, but you know that there are
proxy wars.
Yeah, there are special forces soldiers running around in Ukraine. I know that, I'm certain of that much. One of the things I wanted to mention, and this might be a good place to bring it up here, but is the absence of on-screen titles for people, lower thirds, no mention of the places, the times. All of that is absent. There's a subtitles for the Japanese for Americans to read, but there's no explanation. This is relying on the audience to understand who and what. It's an interesting, a World War II movie made today would need to tell you these things because this audience doesn't know it. But back then, people would know. Admiral Kimmel was the admiral in charge in Pearl Harbor, and General Short. Their names get mentioned, but people would know these things though, and I think it's fascinating how they don't spoon feed the audience in the movie with that.
Yeah, that I do have to admit there were parts I had to rewatch. I'm like, wait a minute, who is this again?
Yes,
There's a lot of people. Yeah,
I kept the Wikipedia entry with all the cast lists open while I was watching. Like, nice. Who's that guy? Wait, who's that guy? Yeah,
I kept getting the admiral and the general mixed up.
General Short and Admiral Kimmel. Yeah.
It's Short. I can't remember.
It was crazy the mixed signals coming from Washington.
Yes.
Where they're reading that one warning they send them, and it's like, well, we don't anticipate hostile action.
Right.
And Kimmel's, then why send a warning at all?
Exactly.
If you don't anticipate hostile action. And so you could see why mistakes were made, because the people at the front line, the commanders, they don't know what to think. They're getting all these this contradictory. Kimmel says at one point, I wish Washington would just give us the full inside story.
Well, and that's the thing, is they were not getting the magic intercepts. Even the overseas commanders of these important bases didn't have access to the intelligence. And so they had to rely on some flunky at the Pentagon giving them vague warnings of things. Yeah. One of the things I read about this movie is it rehabilitates husband and Kimmel and Short.
Because they were railroaded.
Yes.
After Pearl Harbor.
They became scapegoats for and Nimitz took Kimmel's place, and they made mistakes. Short's insistence on putting all of the airplanes together in the middle of the field where they made
what does the one guy say? The one guy says a one-eyed monkey hanging from a 10-cent balloon could scatter all the planes to hell with one hand grenade.
Yeah.
It's great.
That's a great line.
But he was worried about sabotage, people sneaking on the field and sabotaging the planes. That is a reasonable concern. And I think this movie, 30 years later, rehabilitates their reputation a bit and shows, look, it's not all about their mistakes. They were dealt a bad hand. And I'm glad that the movie really shows that there wasn't all their error.
And those mixed signals get to the point where they're dangerous. At one point, they're questioning, is Washington telling us that we have to let these people attack us if they show up? Because there's that one note that they get where it says, we desire that Japan makes the first hostile action.
Right. Yeah. So
and they're like, wait a minute, what does that mean?
So we're supposed to take the punch, and then fight back. There was so many really bad, like you mentioned, mixed messages, and it's interesting to see the simultaneous blindness by some Americans and others who saw it coming. It does show that others who, the Colonel Bratton in the Operation Magic Office, the intelligence analyst, who was off by a week, but he knew exactly what was going to happen. They're going to attack Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, November 30th. And he knew that it was coming. He was just off by a week. And he was basing that off of the deadlines for certain actions, the diplomatic actions. This message has to be delivered by this date because stuff is going to happen afterward, which, to paraphrase the Japanese, because something's happening after that. And what's the something? Duh. And so I really liked that you had Colonel Bratton and the other one, the Navy guy, I don't remember his name, running around trying on the evening of December 6th, or the morning of December 7th. His wife is
trying to get somebody to listen to him.
Every conversation with his wife in the car is so amazing.
Honey, he says very kindly, honey, would you shut up and drive?
Shut up and drive.
If I said that to my wife, she'd pull over and push me on the curb.
Yeah, it wouldn't, no, she would not be driving after that point unless she was driving away from me as I was standing outside the car.
I think too, we should point out some of the good things that the on-site commanders do. Kimmel very wisely sends Admiral Halsey and the Enterprise away.
Yes. Yeah. He sends
to probe for the enemy.
Enterprise and the Lexington, he sends out to sea. And then Halsey, he says, do you want to take the battleships? And Halsey says, no, I'm going to leave them. They're too slow.
They're too slow.
They'll slow me down if I end up actually finding the Japanese out there. And in fact, doesn't Kimmel tell Halsey, if you find the Japanese, use your discretion, like basically shoot them if you find them, which is
shoot first,
basically start the war. I think everyone knew war was coming, just was inevitable in one sense, at least on the American side. That was a good move by Kimmel, because the aircraft carriers, we should make explicit, the aircraft carriers were the premier target, because everyone knew on the Japanese side, at least the commanders, that the carriers were the key. And they wanted those carriers in Pearl Harbor. That was what they wanted, the big fat carriers, and sink them right there, their piers. And we, by the grace of God, those ships were at sea.
Yeah,
they weren't there. Yeah.
It's interesting because they get that pretty early on. They get that message. You need to increase your flights around the island and around the base. And I remember that because as a manager, I go through this every time I get an order from up above. Oh, I need to do more with less. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have enough planes and pilots built in the whole United States to fill this airspace so we could see anything.
The B-17s. Yeah, we need to patrol the B-7. We need 150 B-17s. There aren't 150 B-17s in the world.
Yeah. At that time, we hadn't ramped up mass production yet.
Right.
Of B-17s. One of the funniest, it's funny in a tragic way, but one of the funniest comedy of error things that happens is the thing with the telephone at the radar station.
Yeah.
First of all, they don't have a phone.
Go to the gas station.
Go to the one guy says, yeah, there's a gasoline station about a mile down the road. They must have a phone. And I'm like, that's encouraging. Not everybody had a phone back then.
Great military competence there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then later, when they finally get the phone, and on the morning of December 7th, they notice a suspicious radar blip, a very large one. They call it in, and the guy at the other end goes, don't worry about it.
It's those B-17s coming in from the mainland, which in the wrong direction. It's completely the wrong direction.
Yeah.
That is one of the tragic mistakes of the day there, is that mistake of don't worry about it. In fact, people kept mistaking, people couldn't believe what was going on. Like the two officers who were coming out of the building as the Zero flew treetop height over. Get that guy's tail number. I'm going to report him
for safety violations. Yeah. And then it drops its bomb and blows up a building. Because an attack of this scale had never been perpetrated.
Right.
Before. The British had done something similar against Italy, but it was on a much smaller scale.
Right.
Than this.
And a surprise air attack like this, just to pull off a surprise like this had never been done. And
we should explain too that Tora, that phrase was the Japanese. I believe it means tiger. It
literally means tiger, yes, but it was an abbreviation. Good.
Oh, okay. It was the Japanese code phrase for "we have achieved complete tactical surprise."
Right. There was a longer phrase. I will not attempt it and offend any Japanese speaker. But a longer phrase, it's a shortened version of a longer phrase that means lightning attack, like blitzkrieg, which is interesting. Which is interesting that they use the same sort of phrase that the Germans had, and it meant we have achieved complete surprise. And when Fuchida says that over the radio, that is a great triumphant moment for the Japanese in this, and you almost cheer for them until you realize that no, I'm on the other side. It's like a great touchdown by the wrong team.
Yeah, right. But you almost have to admire them for the bravado and the fact that they managed it.
Yes, some of the stuff that was really interesting in the build, I liked the preparation montage. Every movie's gonna have a little action montage. The preparation montage on board the Japanese ships. I particularly like the simulated bombing run, the low-tech simulation of pulling the sheet underneath the plane with the painting of Pearl Harbor on it for the bombardier to practice with. I like that. That was really cool. And then the ship recognition quiz, with the pilots.
Oh,
They show them a silhouette of a ship, and they have to name Nevada, Arizona, and then he holds up an aircraft carrier. His Enterprise, that's your ship, you idiot. Boom, and hits him in the head with the board.
Yeah,
they all joke around. It's wild. But yeah, I enjoyed those scenes were some of my favorite scenes of that.
I felt the air raid itself. This movie does a fantastic job of communicating the utter chaos of an air raid.
Oh, yeah.
There's fires and explosions everywhere, planes all around, guns blasting away, screaming and shouting. There's a lot of quick cuts, so you're disoriented.
Yeah. And then people doing their jobs. The guys in the mailroom sending messages.
Yeah, they're still doing their job.
There was a particularly interesting moment in the mailroom, by the way, when the Japanese kid, the civilian kid, like Japanese American, brings in the message, and all the guys just stare at him, and he's clueless right now about it. And all of the mistreatment of the Japanese Americans in the internment, all the ones who lived in Hawaii at the time lost their homes, were evicted from homes and lost their property. All of that is contained in this moment in the movie, which is a very interesting, dramatic choice. They could have done more with that, but it's not really what the movie was about. But at least they acknowledge it in a way. Everyone knows what that means. I thought that was an interesting moment.
That was very good. Pat, you mentioned in terms of the air raid, a lot of the special effects in this movie, like the model work and stuff, is pretty outstanding.
Oh, yeah.
Actually.
It's such a fantastic, and you think about the technology at the time and what they were working with and how well they integrated the model work with the live action pieces. And I that's one of my all-time favorite things about earlier films prior to the what we have now is computer generated almost always, is the model work. And I can usually tell the difference in a modern film if they've gone with model work or computer generated stuff. And I really love the models. And they did such a good job in this movie of making it seem real. Like there's very few points where I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at a bunch of models, right? Or that explosion,
right.
That explosion was just a model. Or they did it such a good job of the shooting. And because you have to shoot all that stuff in slow motion in order to get it to play in like real time, because when you do it in a model space, everything moves faster and
right.
It does and it doesn't. But to get it to look real at a real scale, you have to shoot it differently than you would shoot like a real shot. And the camera work was so good and the editing was so good, splicing the real shots and the real. I honestly thought some of the set work was a lot more fake than some of the.
Yeah. You can see some green screen background stuff. Yeah.
But it's really phenomenal, the model work they did with the ships and the explosions and the really all of the explosions. And really, to your point, Thomas, they did such a good job of just the utter and complete chaos from the American side of the ball.
I want to make a quick correction about the planes. There were no actual Japanese planes, World War II Japanese planes used. They were all converted American planes. The North American T-6 Texan stood in for the Zero.
They repainted them.
Yeah, and then they had the Vultee BT-13 Valiant was converted to the Val dive bombers, and they had the Nakajima torpedo bombers was also a T6, but a two-seater T6. So they did a lot of they did a great job of it because they looked really good. The paint
fooled me.
Yeah. It looked really great. The chaos you mentioned, the attack on the Hickam airfield, all of the American planes just the explosions and the planes trying to take off and like showing like these guys, pilots jumping in these planes, trying to get them in the air and like getting blown up on the runway. And I'm like, wow, like this is all practical effect. This is all really there. This is amazing work. Although I think you were telling us before we started, Thomas, that there was an accident that they made actually part of the movie.
Yeah, it's when that one plane spins out of control. I think it crashes into another plane and then blows up, and it skids around on fire, and you can see it almost crush a poor extra.
Right.
As he scrambles away. And that was not intended to happen like that. The plane really did careen out of control and almost kill. The safety standards on this set are not the safety standards that they would have today. First of all, it would all be CGI, but even if it wasn't, I felt so bad. And that one scene where the ship is on fire and the extras are on fire, and I'm like, were those stuntmen? Were they supposed to be on fire? I don't know.
I think those might have been, actual stuntmen in the gel. But and then there was the scene.
The way they had the fire positioned primarily on their back and back. Those were almost guaranteed to be guys that were supposed to be on fire.
You can tell the one guy scrambling away from the crashing plane is legit scrambling for his life. And I did read somewhere that we'll just keep it in the movie because it's real.
Right. I remember watching that and going, that stuntman's doing a great job. He's getting really close to that. Wow, I can't believe he volunteered to do that. Oh, he didn't. And then there was the B-17. Did we mention this already? The B-17.
No.
So there's a scene where the B-17s are coming in, and one of them, the lead plane, can't get its landing gear down. It's got one gear down and one gear up, and it has to land on the wing on one landing gear. And it turns out that's actually was an unintended thing that happened. One of the B-17s they had for the movie had a landing gear failure, couldn't get it down, and they had to half landed on one gear. And they're like, they had them circled so they could get the camera set up and incorporated that into the movie. Like they filmed the scene to make that part of the movie, which is wild. And so you have this shot of a B-17 crashing for real, and it's wow, I can't believe they did that. Oh, they did it. Speaking of the attack, one of the funniest scenes in the movie is there's a biplane up with a student pilot, and there's a female instructor and a young man student pilot, and they're flying along, and suddenly they're surrounded by the Japanese planes, and they're just staring at each other. Like the Japanese pilots are staring at her and him, and they're staring back. And then she's like, Bobby, I've got the stick. And then she does this acrobatic maneuver to get out of there as fast as she could. It's just, I had to laugh when I see that every time I see it. It's a funny scene.
And it all sort of concludes with Halsey coming back with the Enterprise. And throughout the war, Halsey was one of those take charge admirals. I think they called him Fighting Bull Halsey. And you could tell he is enraged that he wasn't
well cast
to be able to stop that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who did play Halsey? I recognized him, but his name wasn't
James Whitmore. Okay. Yeah. Good, classic actor. Great actor. Yeah. But you're right. Halsey was Bull Halsey was his nickname. And that scene of them coming back into Pearl Harbor afterward, seeing the ships on fire, seeing everything, the devastation, and he basically turns to the captain and says, how soon can we get her out to sea again? Tomorrow. We'll resupply and get out tomorrow, because they did that's one of the things is they didn't know what was next. They didn't know if this was just preparation for a ground invasion to take the islands.
Yeah.
There was a lot of the concerns about that, and they wanted to get keep the carriers out there so that they would be a mobile instead of a sitting duck.
That's a good point, because Nagumo, the commander of the strike force, does not launch the planned third wave to find the aircraft carriers and destroy their dry docks and fuel depots. He's like, nope, we've accomplished most of what we set out to accomplish, and I don't want to risk the task force. And in a way, you can see his logic.
Right. He's very conservative. Nagumo was very conservative about the attack and about he didn't want to lose these precious carriers, he didn't want to risk them beyond the necessity of executing the plan. And because he was afraid of the U.S. carriers and U.S. submarines. That was the other thing that they didn't know what was out there.
Yeah. And at Midway, they lost so many carriers.
Yes.
So in a sense, he was correct to be cautious about it.
Yeah, because at that time, Japan's only sitting on a couple more carriers. And I don't even know if they're the big ones, if they're just the light carriers. So he's got almost like if you take the position that airplanes and aircraft carriers are like he's got almost the entirety of Japan's Navy, like the important part under his command right now. Yeah. And I think he realizes that, and we did everything we pretty much wanted to do, except for the carriers. Let's just call it and get out of here. I'm literally halfway across the world from help.
He was probably
But it's one of those turning points in history.
Yeah.
It's one of those turning points, because what would have happened if they had destroyed the dry docks? Because you need a way to fix all these ships that have been destroyed.
Right.
which they end up doing. He could have destroyed the fuel depots. He could have made a concerted effort to hunt, because we had, what, 2 carriers?
Right.
The Empire, the Enterprise and Lexington.
Yes.
And it's, you wonder what could have happened.
Because if they really demolished the dry docks and all the infrastructure, we would have had San Diego would have been we had to launch from, and that just wouldn't have worked. Alternatively, if we had managed to sink their carriers out there, if our submarines or our carriers had managed to, Midway, when we did do that, that was the turning point. Everything after Midway was inevitable. We were going to win. It wasn't a question. Mm-hmm. It was just a question of how many would die and how long would it take. But the question of whether we would win the war was pretty much settled at Midway. I think most people agree to that now. So Naguma was right. It was pointless because they would eventually lose them at the next battle, or not literally the next battle, but at Midway.
Next battle.
Yeah.
And Midway and Guadalcanal, because Guadalcanal kind of became their Stalingrad, where it was the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Where the Japanese just kept pouring men into this vortex that was chewing them up.
Yeah.
When they felt that they didn't want to pull out because they'd committed so many men. And so they're like, oh, we'll just keep pouring resources into this battle that we're losing. And the Americans are like, fine by us. Yeah. We'll just stay here and keep fighting you.
Right.
We'll rely on the Australians, and when we run out of them, we've got our guys coming.
I don't want to overlook the important figure that had a nice cameo here, which was we saw messman Doris Miller represented in this battle. There was a point where he was the black sailor who mans the anti-aircraft gun and starts shooting back. Doris Miller won the Navy Cross and was nominated for the Medal of Honor. And he was the first, and might have been the only black sailor to win the Navy Cross in World War II. He's a genuine American hero, and I'm really glad to see that they depicted him in his role in this battle.
In a future film, I really want to see depicted the story of the 100th Regiment, who were the Nisei, Japanese American fighters in Europe.
Right.
They didn't send them to the Pacific, but they fought their way up Italy,
went to Casino,
into Germany.
Salerno, yeah.
And they won. Their unit was one of the most decorated units.
They were the most decorated unit in World War II. Mr. Miyagi was from the Karate Kid, was like he was from that unit. But yes, they were the most.
And a famous congressman was like
Senator Daniel Inouye, I think was also a member of that. He had an injury to his hand that maimed his hand for the rest of his life. But yes, he was senator from Hawaii, and in the 90s, I think, in the early 2000s. But yeah, they were the most. That would be a great. Someone needs to make that movie. That
needs to be a miniseries of Band of Brothers quality.
There's so many
good stories.
There were so many good stories that haven't been told, and it drives me crazy every time they remake another movie. There's so many good stories to tell. Why are you redoing this one? Tell this.
If you wanted to tell like a kind of ultra drama, like you would just do the Japanese government in this time period. Like that's all you could. You get 5 seasons out of this thing, like because of how crazy it is, and how dramatic it would be. It would be like Game of Thrones, but in 1940s Japan.
That would be an interesting story to tell. Is that story of behind the Japanese war machine in the late 1930s, early 1940s? We really haven't seen that depicted on film, but that would be fascinating. I have a question about the events. Throw it out to you guys. Do you think that this attack was a sneak attack was dishonorable or was it unjust? What do you think from the Japanese perspective, from the American, but objectively speaking, was it a dishonorable attack because it was a sneak attack?
I think it was not intended to be, because you do get the line in the movie, and it was true that the emperor thought it was of utmost importance that the declaration of war be given, or the ultimatum be given prior to the attack, right? But that didn't happen. And I think because it didn't happen, I think it's by definition, it's dishonorable. You always go back to that all's fair in love and war, right? Who cares about honor in the middle of a battle? That goes into kind of the moral issues involved in war. But I think from a technically correct position, I would consider it to be a dishonorable act.
I feel like they weren't justified in attacking America in the first place.
Right.
I feel like we could have worked out our differences, and our differences involved them being in China, which they should never have been there, and were committing actually truly heinous.
Yes.
There's current events going on right now where people are saying we've never heard of these kind of atrocities before. And I'm like, you've never heard of Nanking.
Yeah, exactly.
Then
Yeah.
where very similar things took place.
The Japanese government, but
where heinous atrocities were going on, and where there were American actually pilots flying for China,
right.
Flying Tigers.
Yeah.
Like America was involved. We wanted them out of China then, and honestly, they shouldn't have been there. And I know that they felt they were being backed into a corner by the economic sanctions, but it was just so that they could get more resources to continue their war in China. And
right.
I don't think that's a just reasoning. It was all about resources for them to continue. It reminds me of the song War Pigs. The war machine keeps turning.
Right.
And they need Tojo and the army need this. They need a war almost to, I don't know, feel validated, but it's, yeah. So I think like less of the tactics of a preemptive strike. And I'm thinking more in terms like your reasons for going to war with the United States are not just.
I agree on both counts. I think it was a dishonorable attack, even though there was the individuals involved. I don't think Yamamoto was dishonorable or Nagumo per se, but I think the overall the attack was dishonorable because it was an active war to continue their war, and I think it was unjust on that level too. So I just was curious. That is the big moral question here, that this movie it doesn't really. It does in a way. It does wrestle with it a bit. We get that speech from Secretary Hall at the end as he's dismissing the ambassadors, and we do get a few hints at, yes, this was a day of infamy. It was infamous what you did, and it really, if they had declared war and then we went to battle like normal, I'm not sure Americans would have been as motivated as we were by this sneak attack, this dastardly sneak attack that really motivated Americans and American soldiers. And it's interesting to think about.
And we were able to accept the appalling losses at places like Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Okinawa because of the quote unquote stab in the back narrative became what everybody knew. And there was a sense that, yeah, that they were fighting people who were not just evil, but in a way almost like less than human.
Yes.
And on both sides, there were I remember there's a line in the miniseries, The Pacific, where they mention that the Japanese soldiers have been told that U.S. Marines are all ex-convicts who have been brought out of the prisons, right, and just put like murderers and rapists who have been put in uniform. So you can see on both sides, there's this dehumanization of the other, of the enemy.
Yes.
Going on in the service of that total war that we were talking about.
And I think that this antipathy to the Japanese because of Pearl Harbor almost directly led to the justification for bombing civilian cities with atomic weapons. And I think it was seen as a just retribution. And I know there's debates over the justice of the atomic bomb site, but for me, I'm pretty clear. I don't think there was a moral justification for it.
There's actually a book, I think it's about the firebombing of Tokyo, that is called Retribution.
Right.
That's simply what it was. Yeah, and another movie that they made a movie about this at the time called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which I've seen.
Oh, yeah.
But it really needs a remake, and that is the Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, which was America's essentially first little victory in the war. And the odyssey that those pilots went through after some of them in Japanese prisons after getting shot down, just like truly just horrendous.
Right.
And you could tell, like, there were people like Yamamoto who knew. And at the end of the movie, we get his famous quote where he says, because they're going to perceive it as a stab in the back because this ultimatum did not get to them until the attack already happened 2 hours ago. And I don't know anything that would infuriate the Americans more than that. And he says his famous, all that we've done is to awaken the sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. I've actually heard that there's actually some like historical questions as to like whether he said those exact words, but he surely believed those sentiments.
Yamamoto,
and the movie just ends there.
Yeah, Yamamoto knew Americans. He lived here in Boston, actually, because he went to Harvard. He had lived in Boston, I think in Washington, for a while too. He was one of the attachés for the signing of the Russo-Japanese War Treaty to end the war in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is a famous trivia question my dad would always ask me as a kid. Do you know where they signed? It was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And
that was what my hometown boy, Theodore Roosevelt,
that's right,
negotiated that treaty.
That's right. And so
I grew up like 2 miles from his house.
Oh, that's awesome. But Yamamoto knew Americans, and he knew what was going to be the result of what happened. He knew we were all about fair play and the rules of the game. And he knew that from our point of view, the Japanese broke the rules, and it was the gloves will come off at that point. So
I think even if the ultimatum had been delivered in time, if we still suffered the same level of casualty, I don't see a real big difference between what happened and what would have happened.
In the attitude of Americans?
Right, in the attitude of Americans. However, if they'd attacked somewhere that made more economic sense, like the Philippines, which is where everybody thought they were going to attack because that was where the resources they needed were, if they'd gone that direction, I think it would have been a very, very different war. There still would have been an attack on an American base, but I don't foresee it being the same kind of like ramp up that we had because of Pearl Harbor, where it was like, all right, everybody's joining, like we're all going to war now.
It would have been probably more like the war in the European theater, where it was slow. We started in Africa, then we went up the boot of Italy, and then we had the landings, the Overlord landings in D-Day, which was a slower learning curve. Frankly, there was a lot of Americans had to learn how to fight this war. We didn't do a good job at the beginning, but yeah, I feel like the war in the Pacific, it would have happened, but it would have been further away. Would have been probably much more a naval war. I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting question how the war would have been different. But I do think I agree with you. I do think it would have been different had they attacked the Philippines first. We still would have gone to war, but it would have been a different attitude about it.
And Pearl Harbor is almost like part of America's like origin story in a way, because in 1940, we had an army smaller than Portugal's.
Yeah.
And by 1945, we are one of the two global superpowers.
Yeah.
Yep.
And essentially happens overnight in a historical sense.
Transition from being the relatively isolationist, mostly farmer, mostly agricultural and raw resource producing country to being I'm trying to remember Ike's words about what we were coming out of that, the military industrial complex that America became, and the transition from like almost overnight. We're talking 2 decades, right? 2 to 3 decades, but still it feels almost overnight, having lived long enough now, and just the very differentness of America pre and post the 2 world wars. And I think you're right, Thomas. I think for our current national identity, I think there's a lot more connection to the Pearl Harbor event as our beginning than there is to Lexington and Concord anymore, because they're just the countries that you get out of the result of those 2 things are just so very different. Like when you compare pre-war and post-war, the United States of America.
Its ideas, the Great Crusade, as Eisenhower called it, became baked into the American psyche.
And we have this self-image as the underdog as well. And Pearl Harbor made us the underdog that fought back and won and beat the bully. And I think there's a self-perception in that. And we like to think of ourselves in those terms. I agree, Thomas. Pearl Harbor became part of the mythos of America. Literally, Pearl Harbor is an idiom for dastardly sneak attack or a devastating attack on us, because that's his Pearl Harbor. That was a devastating attack. And I think it's just 9/11 has become for us as well. So it is part of our mythos, I think. And it's interesting to think how that shaped America over the ensuing decades in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, in the 80s, and during the Cold War, and then even the war on terror in Afghanistan and in Iraq, how that American self-image from that time persisted in different ways over that period of time.
We were still using the language. We like there's the famous the Middle Eastern countries that were labeled as the axis of evil, obviously calling back to the Axis Alliance,
Right.
in World War II. The language is still part of our lexicon. Like you said, Pearl Harbor. I remember on 9/11, like that was on the TV news. That's what everyone was talking about.
Right. It was a Pearl Harbor for this generation.
Another Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
We still talk about the people who won World War II as the greatest generation. That we label them. We have the founding fathers who founded the country, but the greatest generation was the generation that fought in World War II. And it's interesting. I wonder how much movies like Tora, but also TV series like Band of Brothers have, in more recent years, raised up this image of America again. This mythological time when this generation of giants stood up against evil in the world, when it was a simpler time. The evil was those guys, and we were the good guys, and we liked it. We liked it to be simple, and we liked that image. And and today it's a muddled world. There's lots of gray area everywhere. Maybe we like to look back at these earlier times to assure us that there can be good against evil, and good can win. So interesting.
Yeah, and we plan to release this episode either on or around December 7th.
Yes,
when we'll be releasing this.
I think December 7th is on a Thursday, and that would be our usual date of release for. Yes. So this is coming out on December 7th. That's
awesome.
Hey, and a follow-up. Maybe we could do a follow-up at some point and do the 1976 Midway movie.
Maybe you do Midway.
Yeah, that was a great movie. I really enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. Not as great as this one, but it was a good one. There are
The Longest Day.
One of my favorites is The Longest Day. That is a fantastic. A Bridge Too Far, about the Operation Market Garden. There's some great World War II movies out there. We were talking about some of the Pearl Harbor related movies before we started. From Here to Eternity, 1953, and then the Michael Bay one, which don't bother watching.
I'll give a caveat on the Michael Bay one. There is a way to watch that movie where it's good. So the first thing, you skip the first 10 to 15 minutes. There's the setting up of the love story between Ben Affleck and all that. Skip that. And then you're on the island, right? And then you're in Hawaii. That's when you really start watching.
Yep.
You watch that. You watch the attack. You get to Roosevelt's speech, and then you stop. And that's it. It's about an hour, maybe 45 minutes. It's excellent movie. It is an excellent movie.
Yeah.
You watch the rest of it, and it's. I'm sorry. It's just not good. It's not very good. So if you're gonna watch it, though, that's the target.
There you go. The 2019 movie Midway was pretty good too, and Father Chip Hines and I did really an episode on that. Yeah, it was good. It was a good depiction of the battles. Put it that way, the air attacks and that sort of stuff.
So yeah, do either of you have any closing thoughts on Tora before we wrap up? Or did we pretty much cover everything?
One last thought I had, which is this is a pretty bloodless, gore-free telling of this story in the style of the 1970s. This isn't Band of Brothers or The Pacific.
No, Hacksaw Ridge.
This isn't like a modern war movie. People were shot by a plane and fell to the ground with no apparent external wound. This was a pretty bloodless, which is good, which means it's family friendly. You can watch it with the kids, not a problem. If you want to read a good novelized telling of the story of Pearl Harbor, Jeff Shara, his novel To Wake the Giant.
That's on my list.
It's pretty good. Yeah, that one. And then he recently came out with the sequel that's about Midway. And so Jeff Shara is one of these guys. He takes the historical events and really makes them and tells them through the viewpoint of fictional characters in some cases and real people, using as much of the real actual words and events as depicted. So it's a pretty good novel just to recommend if you want to go deeper into Pearl Harbor.
What about you, Pat? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so there's a scene in it where, and I got it mixed up in my head again, whether it's the general or the admiral who walks out onto his front lawn and he just sees the devastation, right? And that was real. That was a scene that actually happened in real life. But his aide's there with him because he records his words, and it's basically just, I'm done for. It's this. And I remember, I think his daughter has an excellent quote about him, which is like her father was the most even-keeled man she'd ever met in her life. He never changed his emotion at all. He woke up in a rage and continued throughout the whole day.
That's good.
The other thing I would recommend is there's a series of podcasts called Supernova in the East. And it does a super, like you're talking 20 plus hours of in-depth about the Japanese. And it's just about the Japanese. And I think episode 3 is just Pearl Harbor. It's like an entire 4 hours on Pearl Harbor. So if you want to get a real good, quote unquote, succinct look at Pearl Harbor, I would recommend that. Supernova in the East.
Excellent.
Also, the book Flying Tigers is really good, and it gives you some of the background to what's going on in Asia and America's sort of proxy war against Japan in China before Pearl Harbor even happens.
Right.
It provides some added context, and it's a pretty interesting book. I enjoyed it. But yeah, before we go, though, we'd like to take a moment to thank all our patrons who make this podcast possible, but especially Andrew G., Aaron M., Joseph S., Victor L., and Michael B. Their generous donations allow us to continue to create the secrets of movies and TV shows and all of the shows here at StarQuest, and you can join them at sqpn.com/give. And now we'd like to hear from you, all our listeners. You can send us an email at secrets@sqpn.com or by commenting on our Facebook page or on YouTube or on Twitter. And you can visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord, which is a lot of fun. I'm on there every day. I love our community. So until next time, Dom Bettinelli, thank you for joining me and sharing the secrets of Tora, Tora, Tora.
It was my pleasure.
And Pat Mason, thank you as well.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And once again, I'm Thomas Salerno. Thank you for listening to the secrets of movies and TV shows on StarQuest.
Here's another show on the StarQuest network you're sure to enjoy, The Secrets of Star Trek. Find it wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/Star Trek.